He awoke feeling great pain in his head. He winced and put his hand up to his bald head, only to feel hair instead. He gasped and pulled back his hand in surprise. Bao Shin squirmed and forced himself to sit up, but the effort was agony as bolts of pain tore through his head, his neck, and down his body. Moving was torture. Even thought was intensely difficult. Where was he? How had he come to be here? He tried to fight back the pain and take in what he could of his surroundings. He lay on a cot in a small room with furs all around him and tapestries near windows. There were tall candelabras around the walls, and they gave a dim glow to the Gothic nightly architecture surrounding him. One of the windows had sunlight peering through it just enough that he could see out into the land beyond, and Bao Shin began to understand where he was. This was Ashfeld. He remembered a little of what had become of him. The war party led by Shin Du had been ambushed by night warriors. He had been with them, only traveling. The force had been routed, and Bao Shin had taken a blow to the head in the chaos and commotion. And now here he was. Had he been shown mercy? He couldn't imagine so. Knights in his experience were vicious and ruthless killers. Why show him mercy, unless it wasn't a knight? "You are awake." Bao Shin spun around at the voice to see an older man walking into the small room. He wore a brown robe with a hood over his head. His hands were burned and blistered and tired, and his weary blue eyes showed fatigue, a fatigue Bao Shin had never seen. His long gray beard fell down close to his neckline, and Bao Shin began searching for his staff to defend himself. Behind this man was a nun, holding a basin of water with white cloths dripping in it. "Oh, don't move too much, my friend. I'm sure you've had not recovered." "Where am I?" Bao Shin demanded. "What is going on? Where is Shin Du and the war party?" "Dead, I believe," the man replied solemnly. "I had hoped more would have survived, but God forgive these old bones. I was too late for most of them. You were the only survivor I could find, young man. Consider yourself lucky." Bao Shin glared at the man and again tried to stand, but the pain was immense, and he fell back, clutching his head like it were about to split in two. "I did warn you, boy. Rest. You've not recovered." "I cannot stay. I will not be prisoner of Ashfeld," Bao Shin shouted. "Prisoner?" the man chuckled. "My son, this is no prison. You are in my church. This is the Church of St. Paul. My name is Friar Thomas." Bao Shin blinked a moment and looked around him. This looked nothing like a monastery or temple. "I suppose it wouldn't look like what you're familiar with," the friar noted. "From your tattoos and your garb, I would assume you are Shaolin, one of the monks of the Wu Lin, I believe." "Ah, wonderful. I feel this is a golden opportunity." "For what?" "To learn," Friar Thomas explained with a smile. "I have nothing I wish to learn from you," Bao Shin answered. "But I wish to learn from you," the friar said, a sly smile in his eye. "But that we'll save for later. Come, let us treat your wounds." For 2 weeks Bao Shin laid in that room. Every day the nun he found named Sister Madeline would come and bring food and help change his bandages. She said little, but was gentle and considerate. When Friar Thomas would come, he might bring food or books, and every visit Bao Shin would keep silent. He would wait for something. Torture, demands, but none of that ever came. Mostly the friar just sat there and would read his books out loud, not caring if they bothered Bao Shin at all, and they really didn't. In fact, it was nice to occasionally have a break from the silence. Occasionally he would ask questions, and on the second week before picking up his book, the friar looked to Bao Shin curiously. "You told me my church is unlike your temple. Tell me of your temple. What is it like?" he asked. Bao Shin felt a twinge of regret at this memory. His temple. He had been raised there. After the cataclysm, the empire had begun a slow but steady descent down into depravity as droughts, war, and famine swept the lands. And though the mandate of heaven demanded a new imperial line, the emperor would not capitulate, and inevitably a civil war ensued. Starving families during this war could not afford to keep their children, and some were given to the temple. He had no memory of his parents, and he was ashamed to admit he didn't much care to remember them. Many students of the temple struggled to let go of their past or their loved ones, but it was no struggle for Bao Shin, and for his younger years he trained at the temple. He learned the ways of peace, meditation, tranquility, and of unarmed combat. He was at peace, not happy necessarily, as the world around him continued its constant burning, but he was content, and that was enough. However, the wars between the various warlords had driven many peasants and civilians into the arms of the temple, and that made it a prime target. Various warrior groups and armies made attacks on the temple, and one, the Phoenix Wing Guard, an elite corps of warriors thought to serve the emperor directly, made an attack on the temple. Its glorious gardens reduced to trampled mulch, the imposing and glorious statues shattered as one does to glass. Centuries-old wooden architecture and places of meditation and study all burned to the ground, columns of smoke rising to the heavens to mark the site of insolence, ignorance, and of evil. Bao Shin remembered the terror in his heart. Only a 17-year-old boy, dragged out of the temple by his feet, bound and thrown amongst his fellow monks. His brothers and sisters of the temple, all weeping, trembling, making prayers. He made no prayer. He was too frightened to. He remembered the sight of Sanhu, crazed and exhilarated for the carnage, some struck too soon, gutting monks who spoke up or tried to run. He remembered that they smelled of smoke and ash. He remembered nothing of the beauty of the temple before, and though he tried, the only memory that came to him was the memory of smoldering ruins, the memory of fire and ash, the memory of screams and cries. His temple, the home he'd known for most of his life, was gone. Gone in a flash of fire and carnage and pain. "My temple is gone," Bao Shin had answered simply, unwilling to recollect the agony of his memory. "Yes, they all do fade in time and in war, don't they?" Friar Thomas sighed. "Even this church will not last forever. It's a blessing it's lasted as long as it had. But even if the building falls, so long as who loved it lasts, so long as what it stood for remains, then the church or temple is not truly lost, is it? I mean, what is a church if not its congregation? And what is a temple if not its tenants and acolytes?" Bao Shin snorted. "You talk nonsense." "Then speak wisdom to me," Friar Thomas offered. "Speak to the ignorant, so they may know wisdom." Bao Shin's glare snapped up at Thomas in disbelief. "You would know my thoughts, my beliefs." "I do." "You will not believe them." "I did not say my belief was a required outcome of our conversations," Friar Thomas laughed. "I told you I wish to learn, to better understand what you have seen and what you have experienced. Through that, perhaps I will find new ways to speak to your people, to preach the word to those who see the world so vastly different than I do." Bao Shin smirked at that. "You think it's that simple?" "No, nothing is ever that simple. But all I seek from you, my friend, is words. Will you at least grant me conversation?" Bao Shin paused and shook his head. It was foolishness. This old man knew nothing. He spoke like a man filled with wisdom, but his aspirations and ideals were practically childish. But there was sincerity in his voice and in his body. Bao Shin shrugged his shoulders, finally, and thought perhaps he could knock the smile out of this old friar. Maybe help him realize the horrors of this world. "Fine. Ask questions. I will answer." It was not one conversation. Months passed like days. Every morning, after Sister Madeline had brought his food, Friar Thomas would come to speak with Bao Shin again. They would sit down on the floor together and talk. They would ask questions, share fables and parables. They would discuss the nature of creation, the rationality of good and evil, and the idealism of balance and peace. The way this man spoke, the masters of the temples would have laughed at him. And to be honest, for the first few weeks they infuriated Bao Shin. Nothing he said to ridicule the old man and his beliefs would ever shake him. He would simply laugh, wave it all aside, and keep going, asking another question, pushing the boundaries of Bao Shin's patience. More than once Bao Shin would rise to his feet and shout at him that he was a fool. But he never rose to the bait. He never argued or raised his voice. He simply watched him, or would occasionally say that they would continue talking the next day. One day Bao Shin even tried locking the door, but the man would simply read his book from the other side. And slowly, carefully, Bao Shin began to listen closer. While his old masters might have thought the man a fool, slowly Bao Shin began to cling to his words. Each day brought a new story, a new lesson. Bao Shin, of course, shared what he remembered from the temple, philosophies, lessons, and understandings, and Friar Thomas would listen. He'd stroke his beard and then ask questions about them. Sometimes Bao Shin could answer, and other times he couldn't. Over time, Bao Shin began to look forward to the conversations with Friar Thomas. At first, the very man who would frustrate and aggravate him so now became the man he admired. A whole year passed, and Bao Shin had all but forgotten himself in his frustrations and his anger. His hair had grown out. He trimmed and cut it and left his beard. He laughed at the thought of the monks of his old temple and how appalled they'd be, but this felt right to him. He left his room often now to walk with the friar, to listen to his sermons, his devotions, and his preachings. He would help Sister Madeline in treating the injured knights or peasants who pastored the church. Many were surprised to see a Shaolin aiding in the church, but none questioned his conviction. It was a strange sensation for Bao Shin. Not even when he was a disciple of the temple and the empire had he felt this kind of joy. Yes, he'd felt peace, but not joy, not pleasure. He was happy. Friar Thomas took notice, often coming to ask Bao Shin how he enjoyed his time at the church, and if he ever wanted to leave and return home. "Sir, I am happy here," Bao Shin would say. "I would ask that you let me stay longer. I still have much I wish to learn." Friar Thomas would smile and allow it, but there was always a hint of sadness in his eyes, too, that Bao Shin could not understand. Is this not what Friar Thomas wanted? Did he not want Bao Shin to stay? One night, a year and a half after his arrival, Bao Shin awoke to the sound of shouting in the language of the mire. He jumped up and looked out the window. There were samurai outside of the church, many carrying torches. They were shouting at Madeline and the friar. He was not as versed in the Japanese language as he was in Latin, but he caught a few phrases. Surrender. Die. Give up. Kill them. Not needing more incentive, Bao Shin grabbed the bow staff he'd long since thought he would never use again and ran out to the friar. As he ran out of the church, he saw one of the samurai, a hitakiri, marching towards Madeline. The friar tried to run and intervene, but was held back by a kensei. Madeline cried out in terror as the axe was raised to strike her down. Bao Shin was swift, rushing in quickly and delivering a flying kick to the hitakiri's mask. The executioner staggered back just as Bao Shin twirled his staff into an arc and brought it down hard on the warrior's head, delivering a strike that could crack the skull. The samurai stood stunned in amazement as they witnessed the Shaolins stepping in to defend the friar and his nun. "Leave," Bao Shin ordered to the samurai. "It will not be long before night comes. They will reinforce the church, and I will die before you burn it." His Japanese was poor, but the message was clear, and the samurai glared him down. "One monkey with a stick does not frighten us." "True. A monkey armed with a stick is no threat to you. But one shepherd boy with a slingshot can fell a giant if his faith is strong enough." He quoted the Bible story Friar Thomas had told him before. The kensei lunged. Bao Shin countered this by deflecting, throwing the sword around him and smashing his staff into the head of the kensei. And as he staggered, he would sweep low and using his leg to trip the orochi just behind him. He then cartwheeled over that orochi and smashed the staff down upon his head. The other samurai were in alarm. They moved with a will to destroy the young monk. Bao Shin was not sure what force pushed him on, but each samurai that approached fell to his staff. His mind kept being filled with memories. Memories of the way the other monks fought to defend his temple. The way they'd failed. The way that fire had claimed his home. And then thinking of that same fire claiming this church? No. He blocked blows with his wrist guard that would have broken his arm. And then he would pummel with the end of his cudgel until there was blood gushing from mouths. If the staff was knocked from him, his hands would disarm and then strike in precise places to disorient and disable. The sound of bones breaking and ribs cracking filled the night. And when the combat finally ended, Bao Shin stood bloody and panting over a pile of moaning and injured bodies. Sister Madeline looked down at them in horror. "Do not fret, sister. They are not dead," Bao Shin assured. "I would not wish to taint this ground with death." His eyes then fell on Friar Thomas, who was beaming from ear to ear. "And I could not let the fire of chaos burn down this church as they did my temple." "Come with me, child," Friar Thomas said. Friar Thomas led Bao Shin away from the church and towards a river. Bao Shin knew this river well. Over the course of the year and a half he lived there, the friar would take many people down there and dip them into the water in a baptism ceremony, bringing them into the faith. Bao Shin's heart beat faster as he realized what this meant. The friar stepped into the water and beckoned Bao Shin to join him. Bao Shin paused a moment. "Wait. Friar Thomas, am I worthy of this? I was not wanted by my parents, given up to a temple that I came to love. Then I could not defend that temple when it was taken from me. And then I fled the country I was born in because it did not care for me. Now I am vagabond, traveling with war party to war party. This church, the only place I have known that cares for me. I do not deserve it. That is what mercy is, my friend. Mercy is not something we deserve. It is something given. You have been lost for a long time, Bao Shin. Not just as a vagabond, not just physically wandering. You were lost because you didn't know where you belonged. You didn't understand. You didn't see past what was in front of you. You've been looking for answers, trying to look inwardly. But it's not just in that you look to for answers. It's everywhere. One thing that I want you to remember now and always, my son, is that the true way to understand this world is not through meditating on certain verses or reciting a prayer over and over or even trying to understand the cosmos in any greater way. We cannot understand the pain that this world goes through, and in the same way we cannot understand the depths of this world. If we can't even understand where the wind goes or why it goes, how can we understand the cosmos of the universe? It's folly. It's meaningless. There are lives out there who've gone through the same pain you have, and maybe by giving back to those lives, by protecting them, aiding them, nurturing them the way we have you and you have us, you can give back to this world, and in a small way, just as one piece of evil can lead to cataclysms, one piece of good can lead to miracles. You can be that good for others. You keep telling me you wish to stay in this temple, but this temple isn't your home, my son. It is simply where you found your answers. Take those answers to the world. We will always be here for you. You have always a place here with us. But if you do not share what you have, if you do not defend those who cannot defend themselves, if you do not spread the good that you have been given, then it is wasted. Bao Shin felt tears rolling down his face. He'd never been told these words. He'd never even contemplated them. A wretched existence like his. He hadn't even thought about how happy he'd been. And then contemplating that there could be others just like him. Of course there were others just like him, all suffering in this war-torn, devastating, chaotic world. If only they could have found this church as he had. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps it was that divine intervention that Friar Thomas had mentioned before. All the lessons he'd been taught, Was he now meant to share them? I understand, but I am afraid, Bao Shin said. Then let us remove that fear, Thomas said. Come, tell me, do you accept the lessons that I have taught you and the message and salvation of our Lord? Bao Shin nodded slowly. Yes. Then this day I name you Brother David, and I baptize you in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. As Bao Shin's body dipped below the waters of the river, he died and was reborn, Brother David. There were legends that persisted around all of Ashfeld, the Mire, and Valkenheim of a wandering monk. Though wearing the garb of a Shaolin and carrying the staff of his creed, he was not like any other Shaolin who traveled with Wulin warbands. He very rarely was seen with any of them, wandering the wilds here and there, stopping from town to eat or drink or to meet with people. He was a social fellow, they said, would often stop random passerbys just to speak with them, to ask them how they were doing, to share stories, to listen. He would speak to children as well, children who seemed to be alone or scared, asking where their parents were, asking if they needed a place to stay, and then he would take them to a church far off in the wilderness. This warrior, though, for he was a warrior, was not to be trifled with. When there was wrongdoing, raids that were unjust, those who would attack in the name of unjust or unrighteous causes, where the monk was, came retribution. The fights he fought were not ones of selfish gain. He did not seek money or treasure or compensation for his actions. When people came to him to offer thanks, he simply waved his hand, said that it was his pleasure. It was his joy. And when they asked how he could possibly take joy in these things and not accept any form of treasure or payment, he would tell them stories of a church far away that had taught him all he needed to know about reward and about happiness. This wandering warrior called himself David, and yet everyone knew that could not be his real name. Except none of them questioned it. None of them demanded to know his true name, for it seemed the name fit him all too well. He was a wandering warrior, a wandering monk, with a smile upon his face.